I just want to say thank you for the AHSN network letting me present today. I am a PhD student at Curtin University. I have published with Arena Online. I've got something coming up with the European Journal of Cultural Studies to do with Sian Nagai and Trump. I'm part of the Curtin Extremism Research Network, and I'm on the board of the School of Critical Arts, which is something that a few of us academics started in Western Australia last year. I have 2 cats and I'm obsessed with Judge Judy, and that's pretty much me. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional elders of where I am in WA, the Whadjuk Noongar people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. So my talk today is called Send in the Clowns, Donald Trump and the Politics of Ridicule. His style has rendered him weirdly almost comedy-proof. Election parodies traditionally exaggerate candidates, but Mr. Trump exaggerates himself. He's the frog-necked lizard.
I'm sorry, Rebecca. So just a quick question. Could you maybe, if that's possible, move away from the mic a tiny bit? Maybe that's, I think we're getting a bit of a...
Oh, okay. Is this better?
Yeah, this is better.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
No worries. Inflating his self-presentation to appear ever larger, satire exposes candidates' contradictions and absurdities, but Mr. Trump blows past these while his supporters cheer. Donald Trump's political performance could be considered to embody those characteristics that satirists routinely use to make merry. Indeed, and according to Hans Speer, politicians are habitually attributed, open quotes, certain characteristics such as stupidity or boastfulness in order to ridicule them, close quote. Furthermore, by reflecting on Socrates and Cicero, who assert that we ridicule those whose self-perception is foolishly inflated, then one could comfortably interpret Trump's self-aggrandizing persona as something laughable. Yet political satirists frequently expressed an impotency in the Trump era, as their attempts at humiliating him through ridicule were seemingly ineffective. In 2015, an article in The Economist addressing jokes about Trump asked, does humour have a role left to play? The creators of television program South Park were asked how you satirize a figure like Trump, to which their solution was you don't. Prominent satirist PJ O'Rourke declared, open quote, the election has been completely self-satirizing. Not only am I outraged, I'm unemployed, close quote. These assertions announce satire's limitation when attempting to reform an obvious target of ridicule. Accordingly, it would seem that figures like Trump, who profit by playing the clown, speak to new ways we can imagine the roles that satire and ridicule can play in the political process. For indeed it is perplexing that a powerful figure would flaunt a peculiar and bizarre sensibility that risks ripening their fitness for ridicule and get away with it, at least if Trump's subsequent election as President of the United States can be taken as a guide. Accordingly, given the theorization of satire, how can it be that Trump's performance, which has broadly been interpreted as stupid and ridiculous, found profound popularity and praise? In pursuing such questions, it is necessary to elaborate on the conventional function of satire in order to comprehend how Trump's performance challenges its role in the political process. Apologies to those who were in the previous talk. We're going to have a bit of echo here. Satire is conventionally characterized as ridicule with moral purpose. It is typically theorized as an artful form of critique which exposes, ridicules, and criticizes human and social vices, follies, and shortcomings by use of parody, irony, travesty, and grotesquerie. It is said to convert citizens' emotions of power, anger, and resentment towards political institutions and actors into comical utterances. These utterances pass judgments on those who are perceived as violating moral and social norms. In this way, satirists seek to contribute to the liberal political project of positive change. This is perhaps why it is frequently associated with principles like liberation, freedom, and democracy. The enduring motivation to ascribe satire as a morally righteous political power can perhaps be located in Barkton's influence on satire's theoration. For Barkton, satire was an important concept linked to power and politics, bringing into focus relationships such as domination, resistance, suppression, and rebellion. With morality firmly sitting at the heart of the theorization of ridicule, it has been accepted as a tool which can positively reimagine the world through truth. Accordingly, perhaps satirists perceived their ridiculing as Trump as a just and benevolent task. Understandably, many found Trump's political performance entertaining, for it was both bizarre and morbidly fascinating. For his detractors, Trump's campaign was perhaps laughable due to its presentation as a gauche piece of vaudeville and offensive due to the ways in which it denigrated the status of political office. Here, ironically, in criticising effectively amusing qualities of Trump's performance, his critics were defending politics as a sober tradition, one conceived along the lines of Smith and Voss as, open quote, a rigid and structured activity only for solemn, unwavering agendas and excluding of light-hearted and comical issues. In this course of action, little room exists for jovial or comical behaviour as a form of argument, close quote. Whether one interprets Trump's performance as something to be ridiculed or something to be admired, his shocking and self-aggrandizing qualities secured for him profound media attention. Accordingly, Trump's performance challenges how we can imagine the ways in which satire functions in politics, for it is potentially the case that satire unwittingly contributed to reinforcing the rubrics of control. This can be reflected in the ways in which Trump's performance of ridiculousness and stupidity appeared contingent on the logic, the greater his willingness to antagonize the establishment by making himself persona non grata, the more credible is his claim to be his constituency's leader. In other words, the more Trump's performance was perceived as antagonizing the political establishment, the more he appeared as the political outsider. Similarly, the more satirists attempted to ridicule him, the more it entrenched his authentic outsider appeal. Perhaps then Trump's performance translated stupidity and ridiculousness into something admirable rather than humiliating. Going further, perhaps those who dared to unashamedly play on the battlefield of humour are rendered with a certain quality of legitimacy, likability, or even charisma. Theorist Joe Kennedy echoed parts of this notion when he interrogated Theo Adorno's examination of cinema performances by religious figures on German television in the early 20th century. Kennedy writes that those who earnestly open themselves up to ridicule are perceived as more trustworthy and credible. For by inviting ridicule, Kennedy asserted one is, open quote, significantly at risk. He stands in the gaze of the camera, unflinching, testifying artlessly to his belief, close quote. He continues asserting that this apparent lack of duplicity promotes a sense of conviction that lends credibility to their claims. Kennedy asserts that such performances are fashioned as a kind of heroism, and accordingly they are afforded a resounding heroic charisma. By likening Trump's performances to others that have ruptured the traditional representation of solemnness, one might surmise his performance could be read as charismatic in politics. In this way, Trump's performance challenges the conventional concept of ridicule through the very means by which he would previously be disqualified. In other words, across the political spectrum, sweeping absurdity would typically be brought to order through the painful and weakening effects of satire. However, in the case of Trump, the more absurd he was, the more ridiculed he was, and the more it bolstered his profile. Accordingly, Trump's performance presents us with an opportunity to reapproach ridicule's function in contemporary life. I propose that in certain cultural conditions, ridicule is functioning charismatically in politics. I term this charismatic ridicule, theorized as occurring in those instances of ridicule when the target does not shy away from mockery and refuses to correct those qualities deemed worthy of disciplinary ridicule. Consequently, their invitation of ridicule functions to render them charismatic and has the effect of accruing them power and recognition. Here I am drawing on the Weberian sense of charisma being a certain quality of an individual personality by virtue of which he is considered extraordinary and treated as endowed with supernatural, superhuman, or at least specifically exceptional powers or qualities. The claim that Trump's political success is a demonstration of his charisma is not new. However, existing discussions of Trump's charisma fail to analyze the importance of ridicule. Such a lack of focus on Trump's ridiculousness and stupidity is perhaps the association of charisma with impressiveness, competence, and attractiveness, attributes Trump arguably lacks. However, and as queer theorist J. Jack Alberston reminds us, stupidity, open quote, in a man is sometimes rendered as part of his masculine charm, close quote. Halberstam goes on to argue that people who perceive stupidity in men forgive them because, open quote, maleness is the identity construct most often associated with mastery, wisdom, and grand narratives, close quote. By an appeal to Halberstam, it is readily understood how the production of the Trump phenomenon, which is arguably a precondition of the man himself, tuned into the prejudices of cultural identity as well as the narratives of Western colonial superiority. While such discussions may initially appear to suggest that Trump's charisma is an innate quality, it is more accurate to say that his charisma is afforded to him by his followers' recognition of his virtuous status. We can approach his followers' recognition of his charisma by turning to the idea of a dramaturgical terrain, or as conceptualized by Paul Josse, an interactional ecology. The latter describes a variety of non-devotional actors, in this case unworthy challengers and colossal players, who contribute to the proliferation of charismatic sentiments. The variety of these actors bring forth a different type of role contrast and work together to legitimize charismatic leadership. In the case of Trump, we can understand the role of unworthy challengers as being played by satirists who are unable to curb his political rise. Indeed, the political establishment's participation in this ecology is demonstrated each time he thwarted the disciplinary effects of satire, which functioned as proof that he could deliver on his outsider rhetoric, challenger status, and exceptional powers. In his refusal to retreat from his challenges, he established parameters for a narrative that Josse asserts continued, open quote, throughout the GOP primary contests, namely that the real battle was not between Trump and the other aspiring nominees, but instead Trump and a colossus, the GOP establishment itself, close quote. This pattern was repeated time and again, and through it all, the liberal press, one of Trump's most publicized villains, televised it all for him for free. In this way, the ridicule Trump invited from his detractors and their performative failure provided an opportunity for all to witness those interactions which became evidence of his charismatic appeal. Accordingly, the difference that separates the concepts of satire and charismatic ridicule is the power afforded to the ridiculer and the ridiculed. For indeed, at its core, charismatic ridicule makes a significant departure from conventional articulations of satire in the ways in which power is bestowed to the target of the joke. Typically, and as has been outlined, disciplinary ridicule and satire seek to disempower their targets and empower the ridiculer. For the conventional conception of satire is said to chastise buffoonery, stupidity, self-aggrandizement, and frivolity. By contrast, charismatic ridicule rewards these same qualities with admiration, for they are perceived as being authentic and self-effacing, hence such performances have bestowed the admiration of charisma. Therefore, what I am depicting as charismatic ridicule works fundamentally different, however, for it is a practice of humour that privileges the ridiculed. While the Trump phenomenon is arguably the most powerful exemplar of such performances, he is not its sole proponent. In fact, his performance might be said to be part of a larger trend of political performances that point to a transformation in ridicule's meaning, function, and relationship to power within the context of contemporary liberal democracies. Politicians such as Boris Johnson, Jair Bolsonaro, Vladimir Zelensky, and Becky Grillo make up this broader trend of political actors who have likewise treated the seriousness of political discourse and political representation as something akin to a joke. A question arises then of why and how this transformation should be taking place now. While it is beyond the scope of this discussion today to explore this question in detail, it is possible to take cue from the fact that religious figures analysed by Kennedy following Adorno gave their charismatically ridiculous performance on television, pointing to the role that broadcasts and by extension, networked media may play in cultivating the conditions for charismatic ridicule's effectiveness. In this regard, one might also note the observation made by William Davies regarding strategies for gaining popularity in an age of new media. One surefire way to go viral around social media is to make a public blunder of some kind. Who's to say that these are necessarily mistakes? The clown has an immediate advantage in the attention economy. So while it might be tempting to dismiss this kind of behaviour, I have highlighted that there is a certain risk in not taking jokes seriously. For jokes or what we find funny do not determine culture, but are social thermometers that measure, record and indicate, and by examining them we can understand the political and cultural sensibilities of a specific time or regime. The mutation of ridicule in contemporary culture, such that being the butt of the joke accords a certain power to determine the meaning and function of their ridicule, is perhaps one such thermometer. If so, what this instrument may measure is the naivety of attributing the utmost positive political power to satire, to the extent that satire does not always achieve its implicit moral aims. This failure is disturbing insofar as it puts into question the relationship between motive and consequences, a relationship that has typically worked to inform ridicule's function. Thus, it may be the case that satire can perhaps no longer solely be imagined in Bachter's moral image of rebellion and subversion, as it has become a political strategy for conservative politicians, such that satire became an agent of power for hegemonic forms of ridicule. And if that is the case, the moral assessment of practices of ridicule may need to give way to a more nuanced contextualization of ridicule within the dynamics of power inherent in all social interactions. In asserting humour as a political tool, satire has centralised ridicule in contemporary life, and therefore we must attend to the immediate concern of its ambivalence and transformations. The end.